I want to congratulate Marriage Equality, not only for organising this event today, but also for sponsoring the work leading to the report to be launched today, Voices of Children. I just want to make a few points about the whole area of research around outcomes and experiences for children being raised by LGBT families. I think that although today we're focusing on experiences, it's important to realize that research on outcomes and discussion of outcomes is likely to remain important in this area because we have unfinished business in relation to legal change. And arguments in courts and in the media often focus on outcomes. If we look at outcomes as objective indicators of how well the children are doing, contrasting with experiences, which is what we're looking at today, that children or other people's subjective reports on their lives, their thoughts, their feelings, their points of view. Both forms of research, I think, are very important. Gráinne mentioned the Growing Up in Ireland. In that study, we have both primarily quantitative research on children's outcomes and some quantitative research on children's experiences. And then we also have an embedded qualitative study on the experiences of the children and their parents. But all these sources of data are important to us if we want to get a very rounded picture of what is going on. It is the case that most research to date has focused on outcomes. And as I say, I think that is still important because the arguments about outcomes continue, particularly in the legal arena. And we know, and it has been mentioned, that several credible reviews show very good outcomes for children of same-sex, LGBT parents. In a way, you could say, well, the case has been made. And in a sense, because we now have a large amount of research, it has been made, but the arguments about the quality of that data and what they imply still continue, so we still need to engage with that kind of research, I would suggest. It is the fact, and it is a problematic reality, that when you look at social science research, it is open in the way that maybe traditional hard science research may not be, to interpretation. So people can look at studies and say, well, I don't value that, it's not representative enough, it's not longitudinal, it's all sorts of standards can be applied, and people can pick and choose studies to suit their cases. People who are making arguments from different ideological positions can pick their research very often to suit their agenda. And this is why I think what is very important is that we have some agreed standards about what is good research and what isn't, and that people don't just cherry pick what suits them. The quality of research in this area, even though many of us know that it is, as social science goes, quite good research, is often dismissed, even trashed, on the grounds of, for example, that studies in this area have very small sample sizes, that they're one-off studies, that they're unrepresentative, etc. And I'm just using, if I may, a quote from my own experience last year after I gave one of the papers in the National Lesbian and Gay Federation conference last May, one letter to the paper, and there was several other kind of responses of this ilk. You quote Professor Sheila Greene to the effect that children raised by same-sex parents do just as well, and goes on. With all due respect, it's always, something disrespectful when you get with all due respect. There is simply not enough evidence to support such a bold claim. These studies are bedeviled by serious methodological flaws. That's a particular argument that has been pushed for some years now, and that in that particular case, it was from Tom O'Gorman from the Iona Institute. So what is the nature of the evidence on outcomes? I'm not going to go into it in detail. Some of this research has been reviewed by Iris, and Helen is an expert on this research, and we'll be talking to you, not so much today again about outcomes, but I know that they're both familiar with this work. Helen works with Susan Gollenbach, who's a pioneering researcher in this area, who's talked in Ireland a couple of times before. So there are a number of academic reviews, and I mentioned a few of those there. There are also, quite significantly, reviews and policy statements from professional societies, which by their nature tend to be rather cautious. So in the USA, for example, we have the American Psychological Association, probably the most powerful association for psychologists in the world, very influential here as well as elsewhere, and the American Academy of Pediatrics, both of whom assert that the literature and the research to date show very good outcomes for children growing up in LGBT families. There is no evidence of poorer outcomes than in children of heterosexual families. Now, I know that there is an issue about this constant comparison, and I think there will be a point where this constant comparison is not necessary, where it is not necessary to assume that the norm is the child who grows up in the heterosexual family. I don't think that should be seen as the norm. I think there are far more interesting questions to ask. However, we have to deal with where we are at the moment in terms of making arguments and making cases. And I think that still, unfortunately, needs to be done. Just to touch on some recent research, which has got quite a lot of attention, the National Longitudinal Lesbian Family Study, a very interesting study, which has been going on for 20-odd years now in the US, run by Nanette Gartrell and colleagues. And it's quite often cited. It's interesting that it has information on both outcomes and experiences. And it was the latest journal report in the very reputable journal Pediatrics came out in June this year. And this report's on the 17-year-olds. They're now quite a bit older than that, but the data from the 17-year-olds were analysed and reported in this paper. And in this case, showing significantly higher social competence than in the normative sample, not just equal to, but higher than, which of course is an interesting result in itself. Significantly lower levels of problem behaviour in these young people, although they did report 50% of them homophobic incidents that had been quite troubling to them. It's important, though, in every piece of research, even if the results are ones that you think, well, that's quite nice, that you look at the limitations, and there are limitations of this study. It has strengths in its longitudinal, it has a reasonably large sample, but it is the focuses on families formed by lesbian mothers, all of whom their children were conceived through donor insemination, so it's a very particular group. And then the results on the behaviour and the well-being of the young people were only derived from reports from the mothers. And that would concern me as a researcher. I would like to see more triangulation. I'd like to see data from the children. I'd like to see data from the kids' teachers, etc. So this study has its limitations. I'm just mentioning it because most studies have their limitations. It's just very important to be aware of what they are. So about the experiences of children, I think this is a very important area in many different ways. As a researcher, I'm very interested in this, and I've published on this quite a lot. I think it's very important in this that the experience of children are added to our picture of, in just about any aspect of topics in relation to children or children's issues. It's important to ask children, to look at children's experience, even the experience of very young children, to deal with children directly, not to deal with gatekeepers or to deal with their parents only or to deal with teachers only. We need information for those key people as well, but we need to look at the lives of children. As one researcher says, in relation to experience, how children with lesbian and gay parents themselves name and understand their experiences. I haven't done work directly of this kind. I've done a lot of work with looking at the experience of children, a lot of direct work with children, starting with one-day-old babies on to 18-year-olds and over. But we have Iris and Helen here who have. But I think that in researching children's experience, there are certain issues that one has to bear in mind in terms of doing good work in this area. Qualitative research, looking at, which is one of the main forms of accessing children's experience, has been undervalued in the past by researchers and academics and by policymakers, but this is changing. It is a growing field of rigorous and respected research. It is in part prompted this interest in the direct experience of children, their voice, what matters to them, how the diversity that exists in children's experience is in part prompted by the United Nations Convention on Rights of the Child, Article 12, which suggests that children should have a voice in matters which are of concern to them. But there are also academic reasons why we need to listen to children, because if we don't have a full picture of their lives. And if that's what we want to do, is understand their lives, that's a very important fact. These are important factors that we need to take into account. I want to make a sort of distinction, though, between listening to the voices of children and doing that in relation to, with a goal for participation and advocacy, and doing it in relation to research. These are all very important. It's extremely important, I think, that young people participate in matters of concern to them, that they are involved in organizations which are about children, it's very important that they have a voice in relation to advocacy. You can't think of anything much more powerful in terms of advocacy than the voice of children, and Fergus knows that. He quoted directly the voice of that little boy who'd written to him, and we have heard from Conor and Christine, and there's nothing more direct and more powerful than hearing from people themselves about their own experience. Doing research is a different kind of process. And when we look at research, we are systematically and closely and rigorously examining the experience of young people. We have quite a lot of research of this kind now, qualitative research on the experience of children and young adults growing up and who have grown up in LGBT families. We know about the positives of more evenly shared parenting. We know that there is homophobia even within families, from grandparents, from uncles, aunts, etc. We know that most experience of homophobia is outside the family. We know that most of the kids growing up have no sense of being troubled by parents' sexuality. They don't themselves feel damaged or disadvantaged. In fact, there are many positives, as Conor and Christine have pointed out. The experience of family life sometimes isn't positive, but then, it's not that positive all the time for all of us. Let's not pretend that everything in the garden is always rosy in relation to family life. There is that sense of invisibility, particularly in the school, in the curriculum. The need very often and this was a term used by Pector in 2000, and was used again, coming out as a relevant concept for children in this situation. There are very mixed results on bullying, the research would tell us. So, for example, the Rivers study found no difference between a group of kids growing up in heterosexual families and kids growing up in lesbian and gay families. Rates in some studies seem high, like in the Gartrell study, but bullying in general is very widespread, and I really had a lot of fellow feeling there with Conor as an Irish person with an English accent. Even as an adult, I think I've been bullied because of my English accent. Kids will pick on whatever's most salient. And we know, and I think depressingly, in growing up in Ireland, we found 40%, not a quarter, of the kids reporting recent experiences of bullying. So it's a big, big issue for us in this country. And we need to understand more about it and the different forms of bullying and the different way they have an impact on kids and how kids themselves deal with it. We really need to know more about that. The young people researched are very conscious of homophobia and of its institutional homophobia, state homophobia, and its consequences for themselves and their parents. They're aware of the need for societal legislative change. And while there are many commonalities in experience, there's also diversity. And the research that's being launched today really echoes a lot of those international findings in a very interesting way. But it also is important that we find out more about Ireland. We really do not know enough. What we've got today, importantly, in the Irish situation is the beginning of a research agenda, as Iris and Celia recognise. And this is a very important beginning to now have an opening to listening to these young adults and children. And I hope there will be research on children, because we can do that kind of research on very young children, as other studies have shown. And that we know there are other studies planned, and that what we need is more on Ireland. And I think Helen's research, which she will be describing to you shortly, points to the importance of social context, the school, the society, the state, the general atmosphere, the ethos, the attitudes that children have to deal with. I really would endorse the importance of continued advocacy by the young people themselves. Another phrase that I've always been struck with in terms of inclusion is nothing about us without us, that in any area you need to include the people who are discriminated against in campaigning for their rights. There are huge issues about the rights of hidden groups to visibility and voice, and their role in the correction of discrimination. And I believe in equality, and that lovely short B, I wish you all the best, because I think that's just a fantastic new step, and one that came directly out of the Voices of Children research, which is a great outcome. So finally, I just want to say that in terms of when we have this phrase, listening to children's voices, it can mean a lot of different things. And it's not simple necessarily, because who are the children, and how do we listen? How do we hear? There are so many contexts in which we think children are telling us what is on their minds, but they don't, because a lot of the time they're not used to adults actually asking them questions. When they do, they ask questions like, what is the capital of Finland, which is, and usually answers that the adult already knows the answer to. So there's a lot of this stupid asking of kids questions in a formulaic way. And kids are very past masters at not answering adults' questions. So there are big issues about when you listen to the voice of children. Who's listening? How are we listening? And are the children telling? Do they know how to tell? Have they got the voices to tell? Have they got the vocabulary to tell? Do we just listen to the children with the loudest voices, or who are most articulate? Do we listen to the children who don't like to talk? Do we find another way of listening to those children? So listening to children's voices, we must think of not as a straightforward matter. It isn't. It is a complex process. Not to make it so over-complex that we don't start doing it, but I think we just need to think about it. We need to think about it from the point of view of participation in important decision-making in organizations. We need to think about it in terms of advocacy, and we need to think about it in terms of research. When we think about it in terms of research, we need high-quality research. We need to apply high standards which are recognized as conferring credibility on the findings, because there are people who are very willing to pick holes and will pick holes. The research agenda needs to be a very broad one. It needs to be one that is not hung up on just issues about comparing different types of families, which explores all aspects of families and parenting in all their rich diversity, whether they're single-parent families, families formed through adoption or fostering, or children who are dealing with separation. All of these aspects of family life deserve deep research, and we need more of it in Ireland, because, as Fergus and others point out, we have failed our children, and we've failed our families all too often. But when it comes to research in this area, I would just end with a sort of a warning note that it's a tough world where there is ensconced opposition and where the goal is legislative change, and we need, in terms of evidence, we need to have very firm ground. Thank you very much.